Hello and welcome to a very special video. This is part of a collaboration that was put together by Haley of Haley Stitches, which includes myself and 10 other fabulous YouTube quilters that are here to give you some of our favorite tips and tricks for National Quilting Day. So my tip is not actually a sewing tip. I was going back and forth on what I wanted to offer out to all of you, and I was trying to think what could I really give out to you that might be a little different than what other people's would give you. And so I am going to give you some of my favorite tips and tricks for photographing your quilts. As you may know, or if you didn't get a chance to watch my introduction video for this month yet, my background is in photography. I have a bachelor's degree and I have photographed weddings, I have photographed birthdays and portraits and headshots and all sorts of stuff. And so for a while that was my main career focus. I worked for about 3 years at a mall portrait studio, but now things have shifted. I've gone from that to a preschool teacher, and now I work full-time in a quilt shop here in Northern California. But that doesn't mean that I have left my photography to the wayside. So if you are familiar with some of my videos, I photograph my quilts, and it's just something that feels important to me. It helps document them, and I like to have them as a visual so I can remember. Even if I've given this quilt away, I still remember what it looks like. I can go back and look and say, oh, I remember when I made that quilt for so-and-so. Oh, I remember when I made that quilt for my niece. Oh, I remember when I made this quilt for my dad. And so photographing them is an important way for me to remember my quilts, for me to share my quilts for those that don't get to see them in person, and for future to come to see my quilts. And so my tips today, you don't have to have a professional grade camera. That's what I photographed mine with. For those tech junkies out there, I have a Nikon D800, and I often use my 70-200 telephoto lens 2.8, and I also have, I believe it's a 60mm macro lens, and so those are the specs of the gear that I use. But the tips and tricks that I'm going to give you today, you can do with a phone camera. So some of my visuals that I'm going to give you midway will be phone camera photos, so then you can see that they are just as important, and you don't need all the bells and whistles in the world to document your quilts. I have about 3 main tips that will help you get fabulous photos for your quilts. So first is going to be time of day, or lighting. And so when I photograph my quilts, I either look for overcast, because then I'm not going to get any harsh shadows on my quilts. I've done some where that's my only option, and sometimes that's what you have to take, especially if you are on a timeline to get your quilt gifted out. And so I tend to look for overcast days, which right now in the area that I live in, we're getting a lot of rainy weather. So I am trying to photograph quilts between rainstorms. Otherwise, if it's a pretty typical day, sun's out, birds singing, I wait until what's called golden hour, which is about an hour before sunset. Wait for that sun to get nice and low, so then your lighting is nice and even. You won't have any harsh shadows, and you'll get some great even quilt photos like this. My second tip is to have something to hold your quilt. Sometimes our only option is just to lay your quilt on the ground and photograph it from above. It's totally fine. You can absolutely do that. There's nothing wrong with that. So one thing I like to use, that I use a lot, is a fence or something that I can put pin tacks into or binder clips on. And so something that will hold my quilt flat up against a surface that I won't have to worry about a whole lot of shaking or light shining through. When I lived at my parents', or sometimes when I do go to my parents' still, I use the shed, which I'll binder clip to the edge of the shed to have my quilt hanging on there, so I have a nice even neutral background. Their shed is a light blue, so it doesn't harsh and contrast and stuff. Now that I have my own backyard, I've been using the wooden fence, which has been great for my 3-yard quilts, for baby quilts, for smaller projects, for table runners. The only problem is sometimes my quilts are a little bigger than that. Sometimes they're a little bit longer. Like this one, my snow globe quilt, was barely the right size for my fence, and I had no other option than to get it out then. So sometimes you'll find you gotta do what you gotta do. Other times, if you don't have a fence, if you live in an apartment complex, or if you're like the front part of my parents' house, they don't have a shed or a yard, or it's too big, that's where you get your voice activated quilt stand. And what I mean by that is somebody with 2 hands that's tall enough to grip things. So I've used my older brother, my dad, I think my even younger brother, my brother-in-law, my husband, anyone that can hold a quilt and get it stretched out. My older brother is 6'4", so I tend to bribe him quite a bit, and so I'll have him come out in my parents' front yard and get him to kind of stand out there just to kind of get that wingspan. And then not only that, but if you take your quilt to a park, if you take it to Quilts in the Wild, so taking it travel, which is something that I still have yet to do, you can get a nice scenic background and not have to worry about a fence or just a solid. You can get the scenery around you. I've seen people do quilts in Disneyland. I've seen people do quilts on the beach. I have a quilt that I made of fabric that I bought in Alaska, and so I still have yet to take it back to Alaska and photograph it there. So that is my goal for that. So someday you'll be seeing that quilt in the wild. And the third choice and third option, if you have the space, if you have the budget, if you have a big giant quilt that is too big for one person to hold, or even two people like in this situation, quilt stands are amazing. The only thing is you'll have to figure out how you're gonna get that quilt attached to that quilt stand. So for this one, I used little jumper clips, I think. So I've used those like jumper clips. I'm sure they have a better name, but they're the big, like almost look like a big giant clothespin, but they're metal with a spring in it. As you can tell, photography is my background, not warehouse stuff. So those kind of things to kind of clip around if it's a bigger stand pole, those will help. And then, or if you put a sleeve on your quilt, that's what I did for the Unity quilt I made for our wedding. I ran a sleeve through it, and so then I could use the stand and not have to have people holding a quilt all night at my wedding, and still be able to have it on display, have it upright, have it be able to stand to its full length and be ready to go. So a quilt stand, a fence, a human, somebody able to follow directions to hold that quilt. So those are my ways of displaying my quilts. And then my last tip is to get creative. So don't feel like you just need that one static photo. Get up, get down, get different angles, all sorts of things. So when I'm standing upright and I'm photographing my quilt, if I was to stand and hold my camera, I would be getting the top of the quilt usually, and it might warp it and distort it a little bit. I did a sample photo here using my phone, so you can kind of see what that looks like. But when I get down and kind of angle myself to looking right at the center of the quilt so that my eye level is center on the quilt and you have the top and bottom here, you're gonna get a more square quilt. Your quilt's gonna look very bold in your photo, and it's gonna look like it's ready to party. So that's gonna give your quilt the big wow photo. I like to get really down low, get right at that center. For example, if I'm taking a photo of a kid, if I'm standing up and then taking a photo of them, I'm gonna be looking down on them. But when I get eye level with them, they become that focal feature, and the impact is right on them. So kind of think of your quilt like that. So that's my tip for getting them straight on. But then play around. For my quilts, I like to get in and get little detail photos. If I have a corner of binding that I'm really proud of, I'll zoom in on that corner and crop it in there. And then if I have a cute little peak on my quilt block that I really like, I'll get a close-up over there. I'll fold down a corner so that you can see the back of the quilt with the front of the quilt, because sometimes the back of the quilt is just what it is and just a solid piece. But when you kind of let that corner hang, it gives it a little interest to it and a little something extra. So, and then otherwise, hang it on something, throw it on something. So here's a couple ones. I have my American flag quilt that I threw on the lawnmower just because. I have this other quilt, this quilt I made for my friends for their wedding that I draped over a chair. It's just, have fun with it. Do a little extra, and then you're gonna be so happy that you took the time to document your quilts and really give them that special factor that they deserve, and all sorts of good stuff. And so with those tips, I hope that helps inspire you and get you ready and excited to photograph your quilts so that you can share them with your friends, share them with your family, keep them to yourselves as memories of the hard work and effort that you did for somebody near and dear to you, or even the charity quilts that you know are going to a good cause, or just something you made for fun. And so don't forget to check out those other quilters and their tips and tricks videos. All their links are in the description below. And in the meantime, let's look at some quilt photos.